A young waiter mired in debt receives an irresistible proposal to marry a mysterious woman, a 79-year-old millionairess. But what seemed like the perfect solution to his problems soon turns into a nightmare he may never escape. The luxurious mansion, which was supposed to represent comfort and security, held secrets that made Ethan question whether he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Employees who whispered when he passed, locked doors everywhere, and a constant presence watching him. His wife, always enigmatic, hid something in discreet gestures and calculated looks. The more he tried to feel part of this new life, the more he realized he was entering a game in which he didn't know the rules. As the months passed, previously insignificant details began to fall into place, revealing a dark truth. Little clues, scattered throughout the most unlikely corners of the mansion, led him to a frightening discovery. Their marriage was not a simple arrangement, but part of a much larger plan. Now there was only one question left. Would he still have time to escape? Get ready, because what Ethan discovered is something no one could have ever imagined. The final reveal will change everything, and you won't want to miss a single detail of this unbelievable story. Ethan spent long hours behind the restaurant counter, hastily taking orders as the line accumulated. The smell of hot oil permeated their clothes, and the sound of household appliances filled the room with a constant noise. His days were limited to serving burgers and fries to impatient customers, with no time to think about anything other than the next order. Deep down, he knew this job wasn't his final destination. He wanted more. He dreamed of a different life. But the bills piled on the small wooden table in his apartment reminded him that dreaming was a luxury. Business school, which he tried to attend at night, seemed increasingly distant from the exhausting reality he faced daily. The shift changes were yet another reminder that his life was trapped in a cycle he couldn't escape. The commute home always seemed longer on the days he stayed late at work. His routine was repetitive and tiring. But what worried him most was not physical exhaustion, but the weight of the responsibilities he carried. His father, weakened by age and health problems, depended on him for everything. The little pension he received barely covered his medicine, and Ethan knew that without him, the situation would be even worse. There was no room for failure, no time for regret. He needed to keep going, even if his body screamed for rest. Inside the house, the atmosphere was silent, except for the low sound of the television that his father insisted on leaving on. Ethan felt the weight of time running out, the need to find a solution before life crushed them once and for all. He was at his limit. The fear of not being able to support them was a ghost that haunted him every night, making sleep a rare luxury. What he didn't know was that an unexpected opportunity would soon arise, offering a way out, but at a price he could never imagine paying. One night, the phone vibrated on the table, interrupting the silence of the small apartment. Ethan looked at the screen and frowned when he saw an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before answering, trying to imagine who it could be. On the other end of the line, a firm, feminine voice pronounced Ethan's name clearly. The way she spoke made it seem like she knew him well, but he didn't recognize that voice. She did not introduce herself immediately, just stated that she knew her financial situation and that she had a proposal that could change her life. Her tone was calm and assured, like someone used to giving orders and expecting obedience. Ethan tried to question her, but before he could say anything, she made an appointment and hung up, leaving only an address and a time. The cell phone remained in his hand for a few moments, as if holding it would help him better understand what had just happened. The recommended cafe was in one of the most sophisticated areas of the city, a place he would normally avoid, as a simple coffee cost more than a full day's work at the restaurant that employed him. The smell of freshly ground coffee, mixed with the perfume of well-dressed people who spoke in low tones, an absurd contrast to the hustle and bustle of the places he frequented. He felt out of place, an intruder in that environment where everything seemed to work at a different pace than his. Before he could change his mind and walk away, his eyes caught a woman sitting at one of the tables in the corner. Eleanor was a striking presence, dark hair tied back impeccably, an elegant dress that seemed chosen to highlight her authority, and an attentive gaze that conveyed unshakable confidence. She didn't seem surprised to see him, just made a subtle gesture for him to sit down. Ethan swallowed hard before approaching, feeling that this meeting would change everything, even though he didn't understand exactly how. Eleanor was a striking presence. His face didn't have a single wrinkle. His skin was flawless and his eyes carried a mesmerizing intensity. Her dark hair was tied up impeccably, and her delicate hands moved with an almost supernatural elegance. He looked like he was 40 years old, maybe younger, but the truth was unbelievable. Eleanor was 79 years old. It was impossible to believe, but there she was, defying time in a way Ethan had never seen before. She didn't seem surprised to see him, just made a subtle gesture for him to sit down. Ethan swallowed hard before approaching, feeling that this meeting would change everything, even though he didn't understand exactly how. Eleanor began to speak with frightening calm, as if she had planned this conversation down to the smallest detail. She explained that she knew about his financial difficulties, the accumulated debts, and his father's illness. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized she knew more than she should. He couldn't imagine how someone like her could be interested in him, a simple fast food server. Then the proposal came. Directly and bluntly, Eleanor offered him a marriage of convenience. In return, she would ensure that all his financial worries would disappear. He would have stability, security, and never have to worry about money again. There was no romance involved, just an agreement. Ethan felt his stomach turn. The offer seemed unreal, something that would only happen in movies or books. But there she was, looking at him with an expression that said it was real. The question that was going through his mind was simple. Why him? Ethan left the restaurant with his head pounding, unable to process what had just happened. The conversation with Eleanor left him uneasy, with the feeling that he was being drawn into a game whose rules he didn't know. The cold night air wasn't enough to calm him as he walked aimlessly through the streets lit by lonely streetlights. Her name echoed in his mind along with the absurd proposal he had received. How could such a powerful woman be interested in him? What did she gain from this? More than that, how did you know so much about your life? The precision with which she listed his problems made him feel exposed. It suggested that she had been observing him for a long time. The feeling of being followed made him look back a few times, but there was no one. Just silence and a growing doubt as to whether that was really an offer or a warning that his life would never be the same again. Now just a pause so I can hear from you. If a proposal like this appeared in your life, would you accept it without hesitation, or would you suspect what's behind it? Comment below what you would do in Ethan's place, and what reasons would lead you to make this decision. Continuing the story, Ethan spent the night awake, trying to find some logic in it. The idea of a loveless marriage, without any kind of emotional involvement, seemed wrong in every way. But on the other side were the unpayable bills, the incessant charges, and his father needing medication that he couldn't afford. No matter how much I tried to find an alternative, no solution appeared. He felt pressed against a wall with only one choice in front of him, and with the impression that he was fooling himself into thinking he could refuse. His mind tried to justify the risks, telling himself that there was nothing wrong with accepting something that could get him out of this miserable life. If Eleanor just wanted a name on paper, why refuse? Still, a part of him hesitated, with this strange impression that something much bigger was hidden behind that proposal, and he still couldn't see it. When he told his father, he expected to hear advice that would make him give up for good, but he found a tired and resigned look. The man listened to everything in silence and finally said something that Ethan would never have expected. There was nothing wrong with accepting help, especially when fate gave you no other choice. His father saw it not as an opportunity, but as the only possible way out. The idea of seeing his son stuck in a dead-end job, living on scraps, tormented him more than the idea of a loveless marriage. Ethan realized that deep down, his father no longer believed there was a different path for them. The next day, with his voice breaking and his chest filled with uncertainty, he called Eleanor and accepted. The wedding was held in a discreet office, with the presence of a lawyer and a notary. In a few minutes, the signature on the paper sealed his fate, and while Eleanor smiled contentedly, Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. Something about that woman still seemed out of place. The impeccable youth of her face seemed to hide something much older and more dangerous. The road leading to the mansion stretched for a long path surrounded by tall trees, blocking part of the view of the sky. Ethan watched through the car window as the iron gate slowly opened, revealing the immensity of the property. The place was more than just a house. It was an imposing building, with carved columns and a stone facade so well preserved that it looked like it had been erected the day before. The impeccably trimmed garden looked like a scene taken from another time, where every plant and statue had a calculated purpose. The driver didn't say a word as he drove through the circular driveway until he stopped in front of the main staircase. Ethan got out of the car feeling a strange cold in his chest, something between wonder and restlessness. He was there, standing in front of the place he would now call home, but nothing about the scene seemed welcoming. Upon passing through the solid wooden doors, an oppressive silence took over everything. The inside of the mansion was even more luxurious than he imagined, but there was nothing that felt cozy. The long corridors, the impeccable carpets, the walls decorated with old paintings, everything seemed frozen in time, making it seem like no one really lived there. The sound of your own steps echoed on the marble floor, increasing the feeling that you were an intruder in that space. The employees present walked around in a hurry, looking away when he passed. When they crossed their path, they whispered among themselves, making it clear that their presence was an unexpected event. The way they avoided direct contact made it clear that he was not welcome, and this only reinforced his feeling that there was something he was not being told. Eleanor appeared at the top of the stairs, impeccable as always. Her gaze was calculated, analyzing his every reaction without showing anything other than cold serenity. His posture was the same as when they first met, distant and unshakable, as if he were just another piece within a larger plan. Without smiling or showing any enthusiasm, she just gestured for him to come up. There were no words of welcome nor any attempt to make the situation less uncomfortable. Ethan felt the tension spread throughout his body as he walked forward, trying to ignore the strange atmosphere that seemed to weigh down the mansion. He didn't know what awaited him beyond those endless corridors, but one thing was certain: that place hid secrets, and in some way, he was part of them. Ethan spent his days wandering through the mansion's extensive corridors, immersed in almost absolute silence. Eleanor was rarely present, and the employees, even when around, remained distant, acting as if her existence were just a detail within that rigid routine. He was not allowed to leave without a driver or without prior notice, which made him feel like a prisoner amidst so much luxury. The days dragged on in suffocating boredom, and the only distraction was exploring the rooms, trying to better understand that gigantic and unexplored space. However, something soon caught his attention. Some doors were always locked, and he never saw anyone going in or out of them. Some required passwords to be opened, and this aroused an uneasiness that I couldn't ignore. Curiosity began to grow like a constant weight. At times when the corridors were empty, Ethan would approach the doors, test door handles, and put his ear to it, trying to capture any sound. I couldn't hear anything other than my own heart beating loudly inside my chest. Some rooms seemed forgotten, while others were clearly important, but he didn't know why. Little by little, he realized that whenever he tried to approach these areas, the employees appeared unexpectedly, observing him in silence, seeming to have the objective of making him give up his curiosity. What were they hiding? Why did Eleanor need so many inaccessible places inside her own house? The questions were piling up, and he knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he found at least one answer. It was on one of these solitary explorations that Ethan encountered something strange. In one of the mansion's galleries, among the countless decorative sculptures, he noticed that one of them seemed out of place. The marble was cool to the touch, but when he ran his hand across the base, he felt a folded piece of paper, carefully hidden there. With his heart racing, he withdrew it, unfolding it quickly. In the center of the yellowed paper, there was a sequence of numbers and letters, written hastily by hand. A password, but for what? He looked around, feeling a strange electricity in the air, as if he had crossed an invisible line he shouldn't have crossed. Holding the note tightly, he felt a shiver run down his spine. Something in that house was waiting to be discovered, and he had just taken the first step towards uncovering what was really going on there. The note was already crumpled in his hand when Ethan decided to act. The sequence of numbers and letters didn't make sense at first glance, but he knew that this type of information was not left to chance. He began to wander the halls of the mansion, observing the details more closely than before. His gaze now sought something specific: a panel, a hidden keyboard, anything that suggested a security mechanism. He tested the password on some doors with electronic locks, but none opened. The challenge was greater than I expected. The mansion was huge, and he had no idea where that code could be useful. Even so, he felt he was close to something important, something no one wanted him to discover. Taking his time, he began to mentally map the doors that had security systems. He took a small notepad hidden in his pants pocket and scribbled a sketch of the house, marking the places he had already tried. Some doors led to common rooms. Others looked like deposits of forgotten objects, but there were some that remained a mystery. He advanced cautiously, avoiding attracting attention. He knew that if Eleanor or any employee caught him trying to open locked doors, he would have to come up with a convincing excuse. With each failed attempt, his determination grew. He refused to believe that note had been left there for no reason. Time passed slowly, and patience was his only ally. The last door was at the end of a hallway that was rarely used. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, and the silence there was deeper than in the rest of the house. Ethan's heart raced as he typed the sequence on the keyboard and heard a faint click. He turned the handle cautiously, and the door opened. The room was different from the others. A personal office, full of antique furniture and a huge bookshelf that covered the entire wall. On the desk, photos of a much younger Eleanor, next to a man who could only be her late husband. The two were smiling, hugging each other, looking happy. But if that office was so personal, why was it isolated from the rest of the house? What was there that needed to be kept so well protected? A chill ran down his spine. He had just entered a space where he definitely shouldn't be. Ethan opened one of the desk drawers and found an aged leather folder filled with documents yellowed with age. Her heart sank when she saw her mother's name on several pages, intertwined with that of a man who it was now clear was Eleanor's late husband. He quickly flipped through the papers, feeling a suffocating pressure in his chest. There were letters, bank records, and even photos that made it clear what had happened years before. Your mother had an affair with that man. The handwritten words were filled with emotion, revealing a hidden romance, full of secret encounters and promises that were whispered in the silence. He felt his hands shaking as he realized that this wasn't just a memory from the past. It was the reason he was there. His marriage had not been a coincidence, and Eleanor was not simply offering him a deal. She had chosen him on purpose. The weight of the revelation left him breathless. Everything made sense now. Eleanor's calculated look, the way the employees avoided looking at him, the coldness with which she dealt with his presence. Nothing about this was a game of convenience, but a carefully crafted plan. Eleanor didn't want a husband. She wanted a piece in her personal revenge. Her husband had died without her discovering the betrayal, but somehow after his death the truth came out. Instead of confronting a man who could no longer pay for the mistakes of his past, or the woman at the center of that case, Ethan's mother, she found another way to settle the score. Ethan was the last link between his mother and that man. The marriage was not an offer, but a trap for him to live under the same roof, carrying the weight of a past he didn't even know existed. He took a step back, feeling the heavy air of the office suffocate him. The photos on the table now seemed to mock him. Eleanor and her husband seemed happy, carefree, and somewhere in that past her mother existed, hidden among the secrets of a man who didn't have the courage to choose between two women. Ethan felt a wave of anger and despair taking over his body. He was manipulated from the first moment, taken to that marriage not because it was convenient, but because Eleanor wanted him to pay for something he didn't even experience. A shiver ran down his spine as he imagined what else she had planned. He was stuck here, and now he knew exactly why. But the question that haunted his mind was even worse. What did Eleanor still intend to do with him? The days inside the mansion became a heavy burden for Ethan after his discovery. The silence, once uncomfortable, now seemed suffocating. He needed to act naturally, keep his expression neutral, and pretend he didn't know anything. But with each encounter with Eleanor, he felt the weight of a dangerous game intensifying. She had begun to observe him more closely, evaluating his gestures, his schedule, and even his moments of distraction. Small details that had previously gone unnoticed now seemed coldly calculated. He noticed that his questions about the house, or about her husband's past, received shorter and shorter answers, and his relationship with the staff became something that Eleanor had clearly planned. The tension grew every day, making it impossible to ignore that she suspected he knew more than he should. The feeling of being watched became a certainty. Whenever he tried to leave the common areas, an employee would appear out of nowhere, claiming to be fixing something or asking if he needed anything. Even when he walked through the gardens, he noticed attentive eyes on him, whether from one of the windows on the upper floor or from some discreet corner of the mansion. One night, when he tried to go out discreetly for a walk in the garden, he found the back door locked, something that had never happened before. That wasn't a common precaution, it was a warning. Ethan no longer had freedom in there, and Eleanor wanted to make sure he knew that. The mere thought of being monitored made his chest tighten. Did she already know he had entered the office? Could it be that he was closer to danger than he imagined? The only way to escape that web was to gather evidence. He began saving documents, taking photos, and copying files he found whenever he could be alone. He created a hiding place in the back of his closet, where he kept everything that could incriminate Eleanor if she needed to defend herself. Each piece of information was one more piece to understand what was really behind that marriage. The deeper he went, the more he realized that Eleanor was years ahead of him. She had planned everything down to the smallest detail, and he still didn't know how far this plan went. The fear grew, but he knew the only way out was to keep playing. I just needed to figure out the best way to turn the tide before it was too late. Ethan knew he couldn't wait any longer. With the evidence organized and the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place, he felt the weight of the truth becoming an unbearable burden. Eleanor had not only deceived him, but engineered this entire marriage as part of a plan that he could not even fully understand. The documents, the letters, and each photograph reinforced his suspicion. He was not just a young man who was lucky enough to find an unexpected opportunity. He was the target of calculated revenge, But what did Eleanor really intend? What would happen if he simply tried to escape? These doubts tormented him, and he knew he couldn't risk waiting to find out. The only way out was to confront her and reverse the game before she took the next step. Dinner that night was different. Eleanor seemed more at ease, almost satisfied, as if she were approaching the moment she'd been waiting for so long. But Ethan wasn't about to let her play the game any longer. He took a deep breath, threw the documents on the table, and said without hesitation that he knew everything. For the first time, Eleanor's face lost its usual composure. His eyes fixed on the leaves spread in front of him, and silence took over the environment. He didn't wait for a reaction. He continued talking, saying that he had made copies and left everything with a trusted friend. If something happened to him, the police would get everything. It was a bluff, but it needed to ring true. He didn't have anyone he could trust with those documents, but Eleanor didn't need to know that. The air became heavy. Eleanor didn't say anything right away. He just stood up slowly, picked up one of the letters, and looked at it in silence. His fingers slid over the paper as if absorbing every word. Ethan didn't look away, feeling the tension growing with each second. She finally realized that she had underestimated him. He wasn't just a desperate boy looking for an easy way out. He was someone who now understood the position he was in and was no longer afraid. An almost imperceptible smile appeared at the corner of Eleanor's lips, but her eyes revealed something different. For the first time, she wasn't sure what to do. That game she had set up was slipping out of her control, and Ethan was closer to freedom than she ever imagined he would come. Eleanor's look, previously filled with superiority, now oscillated between hurt, frustration, and contained anger. Feeling helpless, she began to speak, but without her usual calculating stance. Her voice carried a tone of bitterness, as if she was pouring out years of resentment that had never been said out loud. He revealed that he never wanted to kill Ethan or physically harm him, as that would be too quick an end. His revenge was always planned to be slow and corrosive. She wanted him to gradually lose everything that made him who he was, for his strength, his dreams, and even his identity to be erased, transforming him into someone who accepted his destiny without a fight, in the same way that she herself had to accept life alongside a man who never loved her. Ethan felt a shiver run up his spine. For the first time, he saw Eleanor beyond her coldness and mind games. Her plan wasn't about blood or direct violence, but something much worse, an invisible prison made of manipulation and desperation. When asked why she had chosen this type of revenge, the answer was even more disturbing. Eleanor said she spent decades being a prisoner of a loveless marriage, knowing that her husband never truly belonged to her. When she finally found out about his betrayal with Ethan's mother, it was too late to take revenge on the real culprits. So, she created a new purpose. If her husband and mistress had destroyed her life, she would do the same to her son, who was the only connection left from that infidelity. The real revenge was not against Ethan, as he was not her husband's son, but against the memory of his mother and the man who betrayed her. Eleanor did not count on the fact that Ethan was not a fragile person. He would not accept the fate she imposed on him. Keeping his posture firm, he played his last cards. He reinforced that he had already gathered enough evidence to incriminate her, and also recalled his bluff, ensuring that a trusted friend already had copies of everything. Eleanor's gaze hardened for a moment, but this time, there was something different. For the first time, she was out of control of the situation. Her game was about to fall apart, and she knew it. Without hesitation, Ethan presented her with two options. The first would be the most devastating. He would hand over all the evidence to the police, making public the plan she had hatched against him. The scandal would tarnish Eleanor's name forever, and she would lose everything she had worked so hard to build. His reputation, his fortune, and any influence he still possessed would disappear. No matter how much she tried to get back on her feet, she would never be seen in the same way again, reduced to a vengeful woman who destroyed her own life because of a grudge from the past. For a brief moment, Eleanor pursed her lips, assessing whether Ethan would really have the courage to go that far, but he didn't look away. This time, she was facing an opponent who couldn't bend, but there was a second option. Eleanor could accept a deal with Ethan. Eleanor would grant the divorce immediately, paying financial compensation and allowing him to leave. In return, Ethan would keep everything private, ensuring that she would continue with her fortune and influence intact. He didn't want revenge, just his freedom. With the money, he could pay off his debts, give his father the necessary treatment, and restart his life far away. Eleanor remained silent, her eyes analyzing Ethan, as if looking for any opening to regain control, but he didn't give her space. The silence between them became dense until finally, she let out a heavy sigh. With no alternative, Eleanor gave in, accepting the agreement without saying anything else. The next day, the lawyers showed up at the house, bringing the documents that would formalize the end of that unhealthy marriage. Eleanor was sitting at the table in the great hall, looking far away, reflecting on the inevitable outcome of that situation. He signed the papers with a cold and mechanical movement, without showing emotion, but his expression was no longer one of victory, nor of defeat, but of profound tiredness. By giving in and declaring her defeat to Ethan, she had also lost her own purpose. Ethan watched everything in silence, waiting for the moment when he would finally be free from that game. When the last paper was signed and the lawyers collected the documents, he stood up without looking back. The mansion, which once seemed like a promise of stability, was now just a mausoleum of grudges and ghosts of the past. Without hesitation, he walked through the door, breathing in the fresh air outside, freeing himself from an invisible prison. The mansion that once symbolized a promise of stability was now nothing more than an oppressive memory that he had finally left behind. But before he could go any further, Eleanor's voice echoed behind him, cold and filled with something that sounded more like an omen than a threat. She said that revenge never ends, that the cycle always finds a way to start again, and that one day he might find himself exactly where she was now, consumed by something he believed he had left behind. Ethan remained still for a moment, feeling the weight of her words hanging in the air. There was no anger in his tone, just an almost cruel certainty, as if fate were a wheel that turned mercilessly, always bringing someone back to the same point. But he refused to believe it. Without looking back, he continued walking, each step taking him away from that house, that woman, and the sick plane in which he almost lost himself. There were no longer invisible chains binding him. He was free. In this way, Ethan left the mansion, passing through the same imposing iron gate that he entered, but this time feeling the weight of the invisible scars he carried behind him, and at the same time, a new clarity emerged within him. All his life he had jumped at any opportunity that seemed like a way out, without questioning the intentions behind it. Now he saw clearly what he had never seen before. His freedom would not come from someone saving him, but from the choices he would make from that moment on. The bitter experience he lived through was not just a nightmare from which he was waking up, but a lesson in how far he could go to find a path that was truly his. He was no longer a pawn in anyone's game. Now he understood that his independence depended solely on him. With the money from the settlement, the first thing he did was get rid of all his debts. The weight he had been carrying on his shoulders for years disappeared the moment he paid off each one. The second step was to ensure that his father had all the necessary medical treatment without having to count coins to pay for tests and medicines. For the first time, his father would receive the care he always needed, without Ethan having to sacrifice himself beyond the limit to do so. Life no longer felt like a constant fight for survival. Now he could breathe without fear of tomorrow, without the feeling of always being on the verge of collapse, without having to accept any crumb as if it were the only chance to change his life. This time, as he looked ahead, he knew he would not look for shortcuts. Despair would no longer be the driving force behind his decisions. He would go back to school and choose his own path, not because he was running away, but because it was what he really wanted. Your future would not be determined by empty promises or traps disguised as opportunities. At this moment, he felt like he had complete control over his life. The past was behind him, and the lessons he learned would guide him from there. He was no longer that young man who accepted any fate. Now, he was someone who decided his own future. If you've made it this far, it's because this story has gripped you from beginning to end. And believe me, there are many other stories just as surprising as this waiting for you. Before leaving, click to like the channel and ensure you don't miss any of these impactful narratives. In a few seconds, a recommended video will be shown on the screen, bringing another story that you can't miss. Soon after, a special collection will be available for you to continue exploring plots full of twists, mysteries, and overcoming. Choose your next story now and continue to be surprised. Until the next video.